Everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me if I stand here? Hello. Hello, viewers at home. Sorry that I've been neglecting you a little bit, but I'm back in the zone now. And you'll be able to hear to my excellent chat. Thanks so much, everyone. Now we are going to be moving on to this next chat, which is all about children in AI. And we'll have these two lovely ladies on stage, and we're also going to be joined by a guest virtually that should appear up here shortly. There may be a bit of a delay getting through to our virtual guest, but at least with the power of technology, we can make it all happen. Please do remember to send across your questions on the online platform, and we'll endeavour to get as many as them answered before we break at the back at 3 o'clock. And now I'm going to hand over the reins to the chair of this panel, Alex Hutchison, Director of the Data for Children Collaborative with UNICEF. Alex, over to you.
Hi everyone, good afternoon, and thank you, Nick, for the introduction. So yeah, we're going to talk today about a panel about why it's important to engage children in AI and how we do it right. So we've heard a lot today already about our sort of three main topics of trustworthiness, ethical, inclusive. And I certainly think from our point of view at the Data for Children Collaborative, we are fully on board with thinking about how we engage children meaningfully in our projects that we do with data and data science. But the audience today are probably all AI gurus who understand AI and can sit in conferences like this and listen to explainability discussions and fully get behind that. But even without this audience today, like if I was with my aunties and cousins at the weekend for an Easter-type meal, could I have conversations about explainability of AI with them? How easy would those conversations be? And then taking it a step further, how can we have these conversations with children? How can that be a meaningful conversation to get their input into these things that are absolutely massive in their lives and only going to get bigger? Think about how much they're using social media today, how they're using gaming platforms at the moment. I think it is a massive challenge, but we've got three wonderful expertise here today to help us think about that challenge and try and make it more practical. How are we going to start making this difference within the Scottish AI ecosystem and start leading the way globally about how to do this well? So in terms of panelists today, we have got Dr. Mhairi Aitken with us. So I'm sorry, I'm going to read from tiny print now about describing what our panelists do. So Mhairi is an ethics fellow in the Public Policy Programme at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI. So Mhairi's research examines social and ethical dimensions of digital innovation, particularly relating to the uses of data and AI. She has a particular interest in the role of public engagement, which is great for today, in informing ethical data practices, and is passionate about finding creative ways of engaging members of public in discussions around the future roles of data and AI society. And I think the creative ways part is something we probably want to draw on in our discussion today, because I think we do have to get a bit creative about how you can engage children in this topic. Our next panelist is Kathy Mcculloch. Kathy is the co-director and co-founder of the Children's Parliament. She's got a background in community education and has worked in rural and city locations over the past 30 years. Her management experience is focused mainly on organisations working with children, BME communities and families. And as co-founder and co-director of Children's Parliament, she takes the strategies lead for a range of programmes focusing on children's effective engagement and participation with a strong focus on children's human rights. So there's a lot to learn there about that participation piece out with the AI sector. I think there's so much that we can take from what Kathy's experience has been today. And let's hear more from Kathy about that. And our third panelist, feels weird to point upwards, is Stephen Vosloo. So Stephen is a technology, policy and innovation specialist with particular experience in digital learning, inclusion and youth in developing countries. So he's UNICEF's digital policy specialist in the Office of Global Insight and Policy, leading work at the intersection of children in their digital lives, including AI, digital literacy and misinformation. Digital literacy, also a massive part of what we could discuss today, and how we can support the digital literacy growth of children. So those are our esteemed panelists, and I am going to go straight on to asking them some questions, but please feel free, or please be encouraged, both here in the room and online, to submit some questions, and they'll magically appear in front of my eyes. So, Stephen, I'm going to start with you. Can you give us a quick overview of UNICEF's policy guidance on AI for children, and also a bit of an insight about how that process went and how you engaged children on developing that policy guidance?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you, Government of Scotland, for this invitation. And I hope that it's been a good day so far. It certainly has seemed like that. You know, Alex, as you've said, as we all know, there's a lot of attention around AI and the opportunities and the risks of AI. And we see this in at least 60 national AI strategies around the world. And we see this in the more than 160 kind of principles documents for ethical and responsible AI. At best, these talk about human-centered AI, which is wonderful. UNICEF was asking the question, what happens when the human is a child? So as you've said, children have particular rights. They have additional rights to adults. The right to play, which is a wonderful right. I think adults should also have that. The right to freedom of thought, to privacy, to education, healthcare. Of course, AI can be an enabler in all of these. But they also need protection. They are vulnerable. They have kind of developing maturity from all forms of exploitation, discrimination, and other areas. So while AI is very much part of their lives, as you said, and they are themselves, as a cohort, children that's 0 to 18 plus youth, let's say up to 24, are the most active and online cohort of any age group. And that's a global, you know, that holds globally. So they're very active, very interacting with AI, either directly or indirectly. But what we saw was that there really wasn't enough attention in all these strategies and these principal documents about particular rights of children, their particular opportunities that AI affords them, and the particular risks that we need to be aware of. And so we, as UNICEF, decided to develop a policy guidance on AI for children. It's meant to be a complement to existing AI strategies. So it's not going to tell Scotland how to run AI in this country, but it's going to say, as you roll out your AI strategy, this is what you need to think about if you want to uphold children's rights. And of course, Scotland was the first country to adopt the policy guidance in its national AI strategy, which we are thrilled about, and we look forward to seeing how this gets interpreted in practice. So in the guidance, there are 9 requirements for child-centered AI. I won't go through all of them, but we touch on things like ensuring the inclusion of children in the design of AI systems and AI policies. And it's great to be sharing the panel with the Scottish Parliament, Children's Parliament. So that participatory aspect, there's a focus on protecting children's data and privacy. And as we've noted, children are less able to be fully in control of their data as adults, or to provide things like meaningful consent. And these are critical issues when it comes to interacting with AI systems. And we look at transparency, explainability, accountability for children. I like that analogy of how do you describe this to your family and your aunties and children at a lunch. And that's what is needed if children, as users of AI systems, need to be fully aware. So the guidance was released as a draft, and we had 8 organizations pilot the guidance, which we were really happy about, including the Alan Turing Institute, and you'll hear about that in a second. But we released it as a draft because we knew we don't have all the answers. The real challenge is moving from principles to practice. But we now have 8 case studies that go with the guidance, which was released as a full version last November. So please, everybody, we really encourage you to use those as tools. And then, Alex, you asked about how did we get to the guidance? Well, we consulted experts around the world and policymakers in forums like this, but we also workshopped with almost 250 children in 5 countries. And that was a really interesting experience. I'm happy to say that we've shared the workshop methodology. So please feel free to use it. And it's based on really good work done from the University of Western Sydney on how you engage children. But how does one actually talk about such a technical topic with children? And the way that we did it was we first just started out getting kids to talk about their day and all the digital bits of their day and mapping this out. And so they could quickly see that from the moment they wake up, check their social media, to play a bit of gaming, when they go to school, interact with a learning management system, etc., that they have a digital footprint and a digital trail. And then we introduced them to some very basic AI concepts. What's an algorithm? What's machine learning? And then I think the most interesting part and most useful part was to break them into groups and work through case studies. So for example, you're applying to university for the first time, your application will be processed by an algorithm that's going to kind of rank you according to certain criteria, such as whether your parents were at the university or your location, or, we kind of make it up and then have this discussion around, is that fair or not? And what's good about that system and what is problematic? And so in that way, you can get non-experts beginning to think about issues around fairness and transparency in ways that they can relate to. And then finally, we asked the kids these 4 questions like, what are you excited about, with AI? And there were some great answers. How to better diagnose illnesses, help the kids to improve their school grades, help reduce poverty. But we also asked them, what are you worried about with AI? And I'll just close with this, but one of the interesting things was the differences in the children's responses. So at the workshop in Johannesburg, they were worried about AI taking jobs. And that's because youth unemployment is huge in South Africa. It's well over 50%. Whereas the same question in Sweden and the US, the children said they're worried about being hacked or even how lazy they'll become because AI will do everything for them. So it really reflected kind of different children's opinions and views and how local context and local culture influences how we perceive AI. Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. And yeah, completely agree about that contextual piece and how important it is that when we're talking about engaging children and young people on AI projects, it's got to be the right set of people. So there's a lot of work that we're doing that's global, and then there's a sort of statement of, well, why don't you speak to some children in Scotland? We're like, because they're not in Mozambique awaiting a vaccination van coming down the road towards them. They're not really going to be, that would be the tick box exercise of we've spoken to children, and getting that contextual understanding and feedback from young people and children that actually would be impacted by any change implemented is so important. I've let my little iPad go dead. But we're good. So my next question is to Mhairi. So Stephen mentioned that the Alan Turing Institute helped work on a case study to inform the UNICEF policy guidance on AI. And we had a conversation at the time, and I'm really looking forward to finding out what happened with that project and what some of the key findings were.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm an ethics fellow at the Alan Turing Institute, along with my colleagues Morgan Briggs, Sabir Mohammed, and Janice Wong, who are all here today. We're working on a project looking at children's rights in relation to AI. And this started with a piece of research last year where we were piloting UNICEF's guidance on child-centered AI. As part of that piloting research, we held interviews with public sector stakeholders across the UK. So this is across Scottish Government, UK Government, and a range of public sector organisations, including in health and education, I can't remember the whole list, but a lot of different sectors, to discuss how they were thinking about children's rights in relation to AI, how they were engaging children in relation to AI, any challenges around that, and also how they felt about existing guidance, including UNICEF guidance around child-centered AI, and how they were putting that into practice. I'm not going to go through all of the findings. The findings have been published as a case study on the UNICEF website, so I encourage you to please check that out. But I just want to give some kind of headline results from this pilot research, and then I'm going to say a bit about how we're taking that forward and how we're developing that in our current and ongoing research. So a couple of kind of major headline results from that research. We found that across all the public sector organisations that we spoke to, across all the stakeholders that we engaged with, there was a real enthusiasm for thinking about children's rights in relation to AI. And there was a recognition that it's really important to think about the ways that AI systems impact on children, and also to find ways to engage children in discussions about the design, development, deployment of those AI systems. But almost universally, entirely across all the stakeholders that we spoke to, there was a sense that they knew they should be engaging children, but they didn't really know how to. And there was a sense that they really wanted to have conversations with children about AI, but they didn't know how to do that in a meaningful way. And often stakeholders that we interviewed told us that they were aware that there was a risk of doing this in a tokenistic way. There was awareness that if we don't engage children meaningfully, or if we don't have the right mechanisms in place to respond to what children tell us, then it will be a tokenistic exercise, or it will be a tick box exercise. And that's not what the stakeholders we spoke to, that's not what they wanted to be doing. They wanted to be doing it meaningfully. But they didn't feel that they had the support or the guidance or the expertise in place to enable them to do it meaningfully. So this was the first kind of major area of concern that we uncovered. The second kind of major headline finding that came from this research was that most of the public sector stakeholders that we spoke to told us that they felt that there was very low levels of data literacy among the public, very low levels of understanding of what AI is, of how AI impacts people's lives, and that this was seen as a kind of a barrier to engaging meaningfully with the public generally, but children more specifically. And this was particularly discussed in relation to the need for explainability, transparency, accountability. How do we have these conversations that are needed how do we ensure explainability and transparency if there isn't an underpinning data literacy or understanding of AI? Now, what we found really interesting about this is that this sentiment was expressed very frequently, very consistently for all of our interviews, but it was largely there wasn't kind of evidence that was being drawn on to underpin this assumption that there is low levels of understanding or poor understanding of AI. And in some cases, there was also a view expressed that perhaps children aren't really interested in talking about AI. But there wasn't research, or there isn't kind of an evidence base to really tell us one way or the other, do children want to talk about AI? Because there hasn't been enough research to understand that so far. Obviously, there's been some research looking at teenagers' views and teenagers' attitudes, but particularly looking at kind of younger children, there's a real lack of evidence about what children currently know about AI, what their current understandings are, what their concerns are, what their interests are, and how can we involve them further. So moving forward, we're wanting to address the challenges that we uncovered through this research. And in our next set of research, we're really excited to be collaborating with Children's Parliament, Scottish Government, and feeding into Scotland's AI strategy to embark on a really exciting project engaging children with AI. And this is partly to understand children's attitudes, children's current levels of awareness or understandings relating to AI, to find out what questions they have, find out what concerns they have, how those concerns might be addressed, and what their interests are. But also, really importantly, we're wanting to explore, how do we do this? Like, how do we involve children more in the design, the development, the deployment of AI systems? What are the mechanisms that we need to support that? And how do we take that forward? So in this project, we're going to be, developing approaches, testing them out, and hopefully moving towards really meaningfully putting children's voice at the heart of AI. And we're really excited about this.
That sounds like a brilliant initiative, Mhairi, and looking forward to, again, hearing the results of that one and what works and what doesn't work. And there is a kind of question pointing to that in a minute. But before we go to the questions from the audience members, I've got a question for you, Kathy. The Children's Parliament leads the way in a rights-based approach for engaging with children on a variety of topics. And can you tell us about the benefits of that approach, a rights-based approach, and maybe as well some of the ways that you've been engaging children? I think people would like to hear some of the techniques used.
Thanks, Alex. I can maybe say something more about the techniques. I've made some notes to keep me to time. So hi, everyone, virtually and in the room. You know, sometimes you hear a comment or a phrase and you think, God, that's so simple and obvious. Why have I never used that before? Well, I was in a meeting last week with funders and somebody's just said in the conversation, ability is everywhere, opportunity isn't. And it just struck me right here because it sums up, I realised, what I feel about children's human rights. All children have abilities. But because of how we view children in Scotland and how much we're willing to invest in children, adults continue to decide which children will have opportunities and which won't. So Children's Parliament came about in 1992 because children said that they needed a place where adults would take them seriously and listen to them, not just about things that adults think are important, but things that children think are important too. And so Colin Morrison, my co-director, and I founded Children's Parliament in '96, and for a long time it was almost impossible to get funding to work with children if the children weren't coming with a label. So we worked with lots of care experienced children, children of prisoners, lots of naughty boys on the verge of being excluded from school. But we never got funding for anything that sought to work with children as equal citizens. People who had an interest and an investment in their future. John Carnachan, some of you might have heard of him, was co-founder of the Violence Reduction Unit in Scotland, and he often says children are tolerated in this country. And I have to say that I agree with him. It's almost as if they're not entitled, they haven't yet earned their place to be fully integrated into society, to be involved in the local community and how that develops and how they learn best and how they inform new strategies and opportunities. And I would argue that we currently value compliance and politeness over creativity and critical thinking, which of course are essential 21st century skills. So children are often not at the table, sometimes literally. So when I'm talking to children about human rights, I'll talk about how in 1989 the most exciting thing happened in the history of the world for children, and that was when all the countries in the world got together and wrote the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. That is the most ratified human rights treaty in history, and it means that all children should have the entitlements to make sure that they're all healthy, happy, and safe. However, because of our fairly ambiguous relationship with children in Scotland, and while we wait for the UN Convention to be incorporated into Scots law, children are largely dependent on moral luck. So they're dependent on adults in their lives, at home, at school, and community, getting it, understanding that respecting children's human dignity actually not just grows children's confidence and self-esteem, but contributes usefully to what we do and how we do it. And I'll just sum up on 3 main points about what I think we need to be doing. The first thing is bringing unusual suspects together to have new conversations in new places, so providing us with new opportunities and routes to bring other people into a conversation about how human rights are essential for children and how we all need to be on board. Relying on moral luck doesn't serve us well. And the second thing is to ensure that all children, not just the most compliant and polite, have a seat at the table. And finally, we need to think about how we as adults use power as a mechanism to control the dialogue, and how we limit children's opportunities to genuinely and usefully inform what we do and shape Scotland's future. And I think this work will give us an opportunity to do that. So enabling children to, and as adults, to grow their knowledge and understanding around AI and share their views and experiences in the way that we envisage through this work, I think sends a strong message to people who come from the principle of children can't. So whether it's parental addiction, poverty, climate change, or AI, children's experiences and perspectives can help us to create better policies and practices, and therefore better outcomes for all of us. So we're really delighted to be part of this programme of work and can't wait to get stuck in, really.
Excellent, and I can definitely vouch for hearing the voices of the children from the Children's Parliament work, having listened to a webinar where children were talking about climate change, and it was by an absolute country mile the most inspiring conversation I've heard about climate change. And I am interested and engaged, and we work on climate change as projects, but listening to 8 to 13-year-olds talk about it and come up with ideas and not be clouded by adult cynicism and skepticism and boundaries and, well, we can't do that. Just coming up with fresh young people's ideas is just absolutely priceless. So we have got a few questions coming in, and I'm going to start with a longer one. So children tend to engage their imagination when faced with new concepts and can therefore form ideas that might not reflect reality. How do you manage the boundary between what they need to understand and what they imagine from what they're told? So, Mhairi, that might be something you're going to grapple with as you start to look at different techniques of engagement.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. And one thing that is really exciting about engaging with children is there's a kind of a fearlessness in how they approach concepts and an ability to to think of or to discuss aspects that, I think a fearlessness, like that when you discuss this with adults, there's maybe a narrower set of considerations that are addressed, or a narrower set of possibilities. And I think when we're engaging children with AI, it's partly about having an informed discussion about what currently happens or what might happen in the future, but it's also about harnessing that creativity and that imagination to think about what is possible. And some ideas that come up might not be entirely realistic or feasible within the current realm of possibilities, but they might send us, they might help to inform discussions about where we want to go. And I think a lot of this is about informing the future trajectory of innovation, or identify what values do we want to guide us when we think about the future of AI and the future role AI plays in our society and in our lives. And we can harness that, so we can harness that imagination to think, to have an informed discussion about, well, some of these things may not be technically feasible, and we need to have that informed discussion, but we can also identify from that, what are the values, what are the principles, what are the things that matter to children that we need to take on board when we're thinking about innovation and policy and design, development, deployment of AI systems.
Brilliant, thank you, Mhairi. And another question, I think, Stephen, you might be the one to answer this one. What is the international state of affair with respect to the adoption of UNICEF's policy guidance on IA, in terms of the sort of national legislation piece? How formally has it been adopted across the globe?
That's a great question, thank you. To my knowledge, the only formal adoption has been Scotland, but we work closely with the government of Finland. They were our partner and funder on this project, and I know that there's been influence there. We work closely with AI Sweden, which is a kind of government-funded body, and various governments around the world. And this is always the challenge that anybody working in policy will understand is, or knows, how does one measure the impact of a guidance, which isn't binding like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but which is a kind of a recommendation. So I think that we've had some success in influencing how certain governments think, perhaps influencing how they kind of pen their AI strategies, or related laws. And we often see this, that you may have an AI strategy, or the only kind of AI act, as they call it in the world, the one proposed by the European Commission. But often the way that AI is interpreted and used is in kind of related laws, like data protection laws, or in kind of education strategies. And so I think that we've had influence there, but I would say that there's a lot more work to be done. This is really just the beginning of the journey. And really, I guess one of the biggest challenges that everyone knows is how you move from principles to practice. Because it often does require making difficult decisions and trying to balance all the rights. And likely what we'll see is more focus on developing responsible AI guidance and applications within particular sectors, like in education or like in health. And so, for example, in education, we're seeing the European Commission has a working group on AI and data in education that's trying to, one, kind of just create safer spaces and more enabling spaces, and also empower teachers and the students about kind of AI literacy and their rights and responsibilities.
Great stuff. Thanks, Stephen. And you mentioned there sort of education strategy, and that leads on to another question we've got here about how important the panel think it is that we develop critical thinking in children as part of the general curriculum. And I would add on to that, and digital literacy, a better understanding of AI. That, you know, how much do our teachers know about that as a sector today in terms of the curriculum, and how can we help with that? So Kathy, maybe you've got some thoughts on sort of the education side of it.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I've been part of conversations over the last 8 months or so around education reform in Scotland. And what surprised me, pleasantly surprised me, was that whether we were speaking to children, young people, parents, carers, teachers, or senior leaders, there was a really strong consensus that we need culture change. And that this obsession that we've got wedded to exam results is actually doing us a huge disservice and is denying children and young people the opportunity to learn the 21st century skills that they need. I read a statistic recently, you probably know better than me, something like 65% of the jobs that are available now, children at school won't be doing, won't even exist by the time they leave school. So instead of focusing on teaching children to learn stuff and regurgitate it on a certain day of the year, there's a really compelling argument for ditching that altogether and for engaging children and young people as learners in an equal conversation. It's about, I wrote down when you were speaking, about what our work is about, raising horizons, not expectations. And so engaging in honest and equal relationships and helping children and young people inform. They know what they need to know. They know that they need to be able to think critically. They need to be able to analyse and reflect and challenge. But within a culture where compliance and good behaviour is seen as the gold star, it's really difficult to develop these other critical thinking skills within that. And I can't really speak about the AI, the knowledge and understanding of AI in the curriculum. I don't know. From personal experience, I would reckon that there's quite a lot of work to do to bring lots of adults up to speed with their children and young people already are.
Excellent, thank you. And then, so I don't know, Stephen or Mhairi, whether you might want to try and give a specific example of a type of AI development that could benefit from children's input. So let's make this really tangible for the audience about an example.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many examples of AI which is impacting on children's lives. So this might be or AI that children interact with. And some of this is more or less explicit. So some of this is an interactive toy, a toy that has AI in it that learns as the child interacts with it, which is AI. So it's learning from its interaction with the child. It might have voice recognition. It might have facial recognition. It might have elements that allow it to learn from the interaction and to personalize or adapt how the child interacts with it the more they interact with it. So that has AI within it. And then there are less, I guess, less visible or less obvious interactions with AI. So there's AI in terms of informing access to services. So posting information about children, about families, and identifying children who might be at risk, identifying families or children who might need extra support in social services or in education, things that are happening kind of invisibly in the background but have very significant impacts on children's and families' lives. And there are many, many examples of AI systems which are not developed with children in mind. So think about, say, a smart speaker, which is developed not with children in mind, but is very often being used and accessed by children, but doesn't have their interest, doesn't have a kind of focus on protecting children as users of those systems. So in all of these instances, it's really important that we include children's voices, that we ensure that that there's a consideration of how these systems might impact on children's lives. There's a consideration of how children might use these devices and use these services differently from an adult. And what does that mean for how we design those systems to ensure that they take account of the different needs, the different interests, and different concerns or safeguards that need to be in place when it's a child that's using it. So I would say that in all areas where an AI system either directly or potentially indirectly impacts on a child, children's views and children's voices should be included in the design, the development, the deployment phases of those systems.
And I think that's a really important part about who's the primary audience of a product or service, like the smart speakers. Or I was reading an article last night or this morning saying that 1/3 of 5 to 7-year-olds have access to TikTok now. Now, TikTok's over 13, but 1/3 of 5 to 7-year-olds. So if TikTok's doing youth engagement and talking to 13 to 18-year-olds to 24-year-olds about how this platform works and how they engage with it, I'm sure that's very valuable, but are they even going to acknowledge that there is this element of the younger age group coming in and having access to this? So I think that's an absolutely critical part of how do you look beyond your direct stakeholders that you want to engage on that and thinking about the secondary impact piece. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I was going to just kind of go around the panel and ask each of you, is there something that you want this audience today to take away, or the AI strategy leadership circle to take away, to let's move forward into practical application, how this playbook is going to work in Scotland? Is there some key messages that you want either the audience or the AI strategy team to take away from today? So Stephen, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Alex. I would just say maybe that AI that enables and protects children, it is possible. It really is possible. But it's not the default trajectory right now. And there was a great report that came out last year from Data and Society called The Unseen Team. And it was really about how so many tech companies, and they really are often the biggest developers of AI systems that children interact with. And this is not to come down on the tech industry, but the report was interesting that so often the products are developed in a way that they end up being used by children, but the children aren't part of that design process. There hasn't been enough thought about how to protect them, how to enable them. They even came up with this term of kind of strategic ignorance. So it is possible, not just to protect children, but to enable them. And the takeaway is really to ask yourselves, what can I do as a parent, as a child, as a policymaker, as a regulator, and to draw on the resources that we have and to begin to kind of change that trajectory to make AI child-centered. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. And Kathy, what would be your key message?
I think I would encourage everybody to read the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. I promise you it's not a boring, dry, legalistic document. You'll read it and you'll go, wow, this is amazing. Honestly, it's a good read. Have conversations with unusual suspects. In my experience, it's bringing somebody in like John Carnochan, who was a chief superintendent in the police, co-founder of Violence Reduction Unit. People were thinking, why is he involved in something to do with children's rights? So it allowed us to have conversations with new people in new places. And I would encourage you to do that and to look for opportunities for where you can bring children's views and experiences into what you're doing, just to help your thinking. I don't have any answers today about how this is going to work, but the exciting thing is we're going to get together in a partnership. We don't know what's going to happen because we're going to work it out together, and we trust the children in the partnership to work with us to make that happen, and that's the exciting thing. So don't be frightened of that kind of excitement.
Excellent, thanks Kathy. And Mhairi?
So I guess picking up on that, you mentioned trust there, and I suppose trust is at the heart of all of this, trustworthiness. And I suppose that's what it's all about. It's about building trust, but trust is about a relationship. So it's not about communicating what we want children to know, but it's about having a dialogue and a conversation and establishing trustworthiness and demonstrating trustworthiness through that two-way dialogue and communication. I'm not making this a concise point at all, but but I think that's the key thing. It's about having that openness and being willing to listen to different perspectives, to be challenged, and to not be worried that that might lead you down a different path, because it might, and that might lead you down a brilliant, unexpected path, which hopefully it will.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, just to say thank you so much to our wonderful panel members today, and thank you to the audience for their great questions. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. That was great. Thank you so much to our panelists as well. And thank you to the audience as well for submitting those great questions. Most appreciated. We're now going to go on our final coffee break for this afternoon, which is slightly longer than what's stated on your badges, just so you know. But, you know, please use that opportunity to network. It's been a long 2 years, so flex those social skill muscles. Mine's have completely gone, by the way. But anyway, when you, just so you know, that basically now we're all coming back into this room after the coffee break. There's no more stage 2, and there's not a workshop happening upstairs, so we'll see you all back here. We don't want you sitting next door like Norman Naples. Apologies if your name is Norman. And that's it. See you at 3:40 p.m. Thank you.